On April 1, 1990, Arizona Highway Patrol Trooper Mike Miller pulled over a commercial truck on Interstate 10 near Casa Grande for a routine traffic violation, having no idea that the driver he was about to encounter, 47-year-old Robert Ben Rhoades, was one of the most prolific and sadistic serial killers in American history, a man who had spent nearly 2 decades transforming his Peterbilt truck's sleeper cab into a mobile torture chamber where he held women captive for weeks, subjecting them to unimaginable sexual torture before ultimately killing them and dumping their bodies along America's highways. When Trooper Miller approached the truck and heard screaming coming from the back, he drew his weapon and ordered Rhoades out of the vehicle, then discovered a young woman, barely alive, naked, chained to the wall of the sleeper cab, covered in bruises and burns, who had been held captive for weeks and was within hours of being murdered like the dozens of women before her. Before we continue with this disturbing case, please subscribe to our channel if you haven't already, and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Your support is what allows us to continue bringing these important stories to light. The arrest of Robert Ben Rhoades ended a reign of terror that had lasted from approximately 1975 to 1990, 15 to 20 years during which Rhoades crisscrossed America's interstate highway system as a long-haul trucker, picking up hitchhikers, sex workers, and runaways at truck stops and rest areas, holding them captive in his specially modified truck, equipped with chains, torture devices, and soundproofing, and killing them when he tired of torturing them. Rhoades was eventually convicted of 3 murders, those of Regina K. Walters and Ricky Lee Jones in 1990, and Douglas Scott Ziskowski and Patricia Walsh in 1990. But investigators believe he killed at least 50 women, and possibly more than 100 over his 2-decade spree, making him one of the most prolific serial killers in American history. His crimes went undetected for so long because the perfect storm of factors that made Rhoades nearly impossible to catch. He operated across multiple jurisdictions spanning dozens of states. His victims were often marginalized women whose disappearances weren't immediately reported or investigated, and he disposed of bodies in remote areas along highways where they might not be found for years, if at all. This is the story of how one truck driver used America's interstate highway system as his personal hunting ground, how he evaded capture for 2 decades despite mounting evidence, and how his case led the FBI to establish the Highway Serial Killings Initiative after discovering that long-haul trucking provides the perfect cover for serial predators. Robert Ben Rhoades was born on November 22, 1945, in Council Bluffs, Iowa, a working-class city on the Nebraska border along the Missouri River. Little is publicly known about his early childhood, though later psychological evaluations would suggest he came from a troubled home environment with possible abuse or neglect. What is documented is that by his teenage years, Rhoades was already exhibiting the warning signs that criminologists now recognize as predictors of serial violence: cruelty to animals, fascination with bondage and torture, social isolation, and inappropriate sexual behavior. In the early 1960s, while still in his late teens, Rhoades joined the United States Marine Corps. Military records show he served for approximately 3 years before being discharged, though the circumstances of his discharge remain unclear. Some sources suggest he received a less than honorable discharge, possibly related to disciplinary issues, while others indicate he simply completed his service. What is clear is that during or shortly after his military service, Rhoades began developing the sexual sadism that would define his crimes, an obsessive interest in BDSM, bondage, torture, and complete domination and control over victims. By the late 1960s, Rhoades had married his first wife, whose identity has been protected in most court documents. The marriage was troubled from the start, with his wife later telling investigators that Rhoades exhibited increasingly disturbing sexual behavior, including forcing her to participate in bondage scenarios, photographing her in degrading positions, and expressing fantasies about torturing and killing women. The marriage ended in divorce in the early 1970s, with his ex-wife fleeing the relationship and later telling authorities she believed she was lucky to have escaped alive. In the mid-1970s, Rhoades began his career as a long-haul truck driver, obtaining his commercial driver's license and finding work with various trucking companies that hauled freight across the country. The job was perfect for someone like Rhoades. It required long periods of solitude, allowed him to travel thousands of miles across multiple states, and gave him access to vulnerable populations at truck stops and rest areas. Long-haul truckers often spend weeks on the road, sleeping in their trucks, with minimal oversight from employers or law enforcement. For Rhoades, this lifestyle provided the perfect cover for his dark obsessions. Investigators believe Rhoades began killing in the mid to late 1970s, though pinpointing his first victim has proven impossible due to the transient nature of his crimes and the lack of bodies recovered. What is known is that Rhoades developed a specific modus operandi that he would refine over 2 decades. He would target vulnerable women, hitchhikers, sex workers, runaways, women stranded at truck stops, offering them rides, money, food, or help. Once they were in his truck, Rhoades would use a combination of drugs, weapons, and physical force to subdue them, then drive them to isolated locations where he would transfer them from the passenger cab to the sleeper compartment. Rhoades had extensively modified his truck's sleeper cab to serve as a torture chamber. The walls were reinforced and soundproofed with insulation to muffle screams. He installed heavy-duty chains and restraints bolted to the walls and floor, designed to keep victims immobilized in various positions. He carried a collection of torture implements including whips, clamps, knives, and electrical devices used to inflict pain. He kept women's clothing, wigs, makeup, and accessories that he would force his captives to wear for photographs he took of them during their captivity. Most disturbingly, he carried cleaning supplies, tarps, and tools specifically for disposing of bodies and sanitizing his truck afterward. Rhoades' pattern was to hold women captive for days, weeks, or sometimes even months, while he continued his cross-country driving routes. He would park in remote rest areas or truck stops, keeping his victims chained in the back while he slept or took breaks. When he was driving, his captives would be bound and gagged, unable to escape or call for help, even if the truck stopped at weighing stations or inspection points. During their captivity, Rhoades would subject them to prolonged sexual torture, taking photographs to document his crimes, apparently deriving pleasure not just from the physical torture, but from the complete psychological domination and terror he inflicted. When Rhoades tired of a victim, or when he felt the risk of keeping her was too high, he would kill her, usually through strangulation or stabbing, though some victims showed evidence of being tortured to death. He would then dispose of the body in remote areas along highways, often stripping the body naked and removing anything that might help identify the victim. He deliberately chose disposal sites in different states and jurisdictions, understanding that this would make it extremely difficult for law enforcement to connect the cases or identify a pattern. The first confirmed victim that investigators have been able to definitively link to Rhoades is Regina K. Walters, though she was certainly not his first kill. Regina, just 14 years old, ran away from her home in Pasadena, Texas, in February 1990, along with her boyfriend Ricky Lee Jones, who was 18. The two teenagers were hitchhiking, trying to make their way to a better life somewhere far from their troubled homes. On February 2, 1990, somewhere along Interstate 10 in Texas, Robert Ben Rhoades picked them up in his truck. What happened over the next 2 months remains one of the most horrifying documented cases of serial torture and murder in American history. Rhoades held Regina and Ricky captive in his truck for approximately 8 weeks, torturing them both, but focusing his sadistic attention primarily on Regina. He forced the teenagers to witness each other's torture, using their emotional bonds against them, threatening to kill one if the other didn't comply with his demands. He photographed Regina extensively during her captivity, creating a visual record of her deteriorating physical and mental state as weeks of torture took their toll. At some point in late February or early March 1990, Rhoades murdered Ricky Lee Jones. His body was never recovered, and the exact circumstances of his death remain unknown, though Regina, who witnessed the killing, later indicated to another captive that Ricky had been tortured to death. With Ricky gone, Regina was completely alone with her captor, held prisoner in the truck as Rhoades continued his routes across the western United States, stopping in remote locations to torture her, sleeping next to her chained body, treating her as his possession rather than a human being. The photographs that Rhoades took of Regina during her captivity, later discovered by investigators, show her physical transformation over the 8-week period. Early photos show a frightened but still defiant teenager. Later photos show increasing signs of physical trauma, bruises, cuts, signs of starvation. The final photograph, taken just before Rhoades murdered her, shows Regina in an abandoned barn in Illinois, wearing a black dress and heels that Rhoades had forced her to put on, her face showing a combination of terror, resignation, and despair. Her hair, which had been long when she was abducted, had been cut short by Rhoades. The photograph is one of the most haunting images in criminal history, a visual record of a young girl's final moments before being murdered by a monster. On April 1, 1990, Rhoades murdered Regina K. Walters. He had driven to a remote area near Millard County, Utah, an isolated stretch of highway with an abandoned barn nearby. He took Regina from the truck, led her into the barn, posed her for final photographs, then strangled her to death with his hands. He left her body in the barn and drove away, believing, as he had apparently done dozens of times before, that by the time anyone found the body, he would be hundreds of miles away and impossible to track. But April 1st, 1990, would be Robert Ben Rhoades' last day of freedom, though he didn't know it yet, while he was murdering Regina Walters in Utah. Events were unfolding in Arizona that would lead to his capture just hours later. Just days before murdering Regina Walters, Robert Ben Rhoades had picked up another victim at a truck stop along Interstate 10 in Arizona. A 20-year-old woman whose identity has been protected in court records, but who investigators came to call Victim A. She was a sex worker struggling with drug addiction, exactly the type of vulnerable woman Rhoades had been targeting for 2 decades. He offered her money for sex, she got into his truck, and within minutes, Rhoades had subdued her with a combination of drugs and physical force. He drove her to a remote location, transferred her to the sleeper cab, chained her to the wall, and began the torture routine he had perfected over countless victims. Victim A was kept captive for approximately 1 week, during which Rhoades continued his driving routes while she remained chained in the back of his truck. She was sexually tortured, photographed, and subjected to the same psychological terror that had broken so many women before her. But unlike Regina Walters, victim A would survive, though not through any mercy on Rhoades's part. She would be saved by a random traffic stop. On the morning of April 1st, 1990, Arizona Highway Patrol Trooper Mike Miller was conducting routine traffic enforcement on Interstate 10 near Casa Grande, Arizona, when he observed a white Peterbilt commercial truck commit a minor traffic violation, failure to maintain lane, or possibly exceeding the speed limit. Trooper Miller activated his lights and sirens and pulled the truck over to the shoulder of the highway. This type of traffic stop was routine for troopers patrolling the interstate. Truckers were stopped dozens of times daily for minor violations, citations were issued, and everyone went on their way. But as Trooper Miller approached the truck and made contact with the driver, a middle-aged white male with glasses who identified himself as Robert Ben Rhoades, something felt wrong. Miller later said he couldn't articulate exactly what triggered his concern, but experienced officers develop an instinct for when something isn't right. Perhaps it was Rhoades's nervous demeanor, perhaps it was something in his eyes, or perhaps it was simply the way Rhoades seemed eager for Miller to write the ticket and leave. Whatever the reason, Miller asked Rhoades for permission to inspect the truck. Under the Fourth Amendment, law enforcement generally cannot search a vehicle without probable cause, a warrant, or consent. But Rhoades, either believing he had nothing visible that would incriminate him, or simply not wanting to raise suspicion by refusing, gave consent. Trooper Miller began walking around the truck, conducting a visual inspection of the exterior, checking the cargo area, and finally approaching the sleeper cab. That's when he heard it, a muffled sound coming from inside the sleeper compartment. At first, Miller thought it might be a radio or some equipment, but then he heard it again. A human voice, possibly crying or screaming, being suppressed by something. Miller immediately drew his service weapon, ordered Rhoades to the ground, called for backup, and demanded that Rhoades open the sleeper cab. What Trooper Miller found inside the sleeper compartment shocked even a veteran law enforcement officer who had seen countless terrible things in his career. A young woman was chained to the wall by her wrists and ankles, naked except for remnants of lingerie, covered in bruises and burns, clearly malnourished and dehydrated. The compartment itself was a nightmare. Soundproofed walls, heavy chains and restraints bolted to every surface, torture implements laid out on shelves, photographs of women in various states of torture and terror, and cleaning supplies clearly intended for disposing of evidence. The woman, victim A, was immediately freed from her restraints and transported to a nearby hospital, where she was treated for dehydration, malnutrition, multiple injuries from sexual assault and torture, and severe psychological trauma. She was incoherent initially, having been drugged by Rhoades, but as the drugs wore off and she realized she had been rescued, she began telling investigators what had happened to her. She described being picked up, drugged, chained, tortured, and held captive for a week. She said Rhoades had told her he had done this to many women before, that some of them were now dead, and that she would be next. Robert Ben Rhoades was immediately arrested and charged with kidnapping, sexual assault, and weapons violations. As investigators began processing his truck as a crime scene, they discovered an absolute treasure trove of evidence linking Rhoades to numerous crimes across multiple states. They found hundreds of photographs showing different women in various stages of captivity and torture. Some women appeared to be alive but terrified. Others appeared to be unconscious or possibly dead. They found jewelry, clothing, and personal items belonging to numerous women, items Rhoades had kept as trophies. They found detailed logs documenting his travel routes, some with cryptic notations that investigators believe corresponded to when and where he had picked up or disposed of victims. Most chillingly, they found the photographs of Regina K. Walters showing her deterioration over the 8 weeks she was held captive, culminating in the final photograph taken in the barn just before her murder. At that point, investigators didn't know who the girl in the photos was or whether she was alive or dead, but the visual documentation of her captivity made clear that Rhoades was responsible for her fate. The investigation into Robert Ben Rhoades quickly expanded from a single kidnapping case to a multi-state serial murder investigation. The FBI was brought in, and agents began the painstaking process of trying to identify the women in Rhoades' photographs, track his movements over the previous decades, and connect him to unsolved murders and missing persons cases across the country. What they discovered was stunning in its scope and horrifying in its detail. Investigators interviewed dozens of Rhoades' former employers, co-workers, and acquaintances. They learned that Rhoades had worked for various trucking companies over the years, always as an independent contractor or short-term employee, never staying in one place long enough to raise suspicions. They learned that he had been married multiple times, with each marriage ending after his wives fled, terrified of his increasingly violent sexual demands. One ex-wife told investigators she had reported Rhoades to police years earlier after he tortured her, but the charges had been dropped when she declined to testify, too afraid of what he might do to her. Most disturbingly, investigators discovered that Rhoades had been arrested before for similar offences, but had never been prosecuted successfully. In 1985, he had been arrested in Texas after a woman escaped from his truck and reported being held captive and tortured. But the case fell apart when the woman, a sex worker with a criminal record and drug addiction, was deemed not credible by prosecutors who felt a jury wouldn't believe her testimony over that of a clean-cut truck driver with no felony convictions. Rhoades walked free, and the woman's allegations were filed away as an unfounded complaint. In 1987, Rhoades was stopped at a weigh station in Oklahoma, and an inspector noted that his truck had unusual modifications, including reinforced walls and chains in the sleeper cab. Rhoades explained that he sometimes transported his girlfriend and that the chains were for securing cargo. The inspector, having no probable cause to search further and no reason to suspect criminal activity, allowed Rhoades to continue. Had that inspector been more suspicious, had he looked more closely at the modifications, he might have discovered evidence of Rhoades' crimes and saved countless lives. These missed opportunities haunted investigators as they realized how many times Rhoades had been on law enforcement's radar but had slipped through the cracks. His crimes continued for so long, not because he was a criminal mastermind, but because the very nature of long-haul trucking, crossing state lines constantly, operating in multiple jurisdictions, targeting victims whose disappearances often went unreported, made it nearly impossible for any single law enforcement agency to see the pattern. The FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit became involved in the case, and profilers worked with investigators to understand Rhoades' psychology and methodology. They concluded that Rhoades was a sexual sadist, someone who derives sexual pleasure specifically from inflicting pain, suffering, and terror on others. Unlike killers who murder quickly, sexual sadists like Rhoades prolong their victims' suffering because the torture itself is the primary motivation, more important even than the killing. The FBI noted that Rhoades' extensive documentation of his crimes, the hundreds of photographs he took of his victims, was typical of sexual sadists who use visual records to relive their crimes and fuel future fantasies. Profilers also concluded that Rhoades almost certainly began killing much earlier than 1990, possibly as early as the mid-1970s when he first became a trucker. They based this on several factors: the sophistication of his methods, the modifications to his truck, his calm demeanor when arrested, and the sheer volume of photographs and trophies he had collected. Experienced criminals who have been offending for years develop refined techniques, and everything about Rhoades' operation suggested he had been doing this for a long time. The FBI began cross-referencing Rhoades' known travel routes, reconstructed from employment records, fuel receipts, way station logs, and his own travel logs, with unsolved murders and missing persons cases from the 1970s and 1980s. What emerged was a horrifying map of death stretching across America's interstate highway system. Dozens of women had been found murdered along highways in states where Rhoades had been driving around the times of the murders. Dozens more women had disappeared from truck stops and rest areas in locations where Rhoades had been present. In many cases, the missing women were never found, their bodies possibly disposed of in remote areas or water where they would never be recovered. One particularly tragic case that investigators linked to Rhoades involved Douglas Scott Ziskowski and Patricia Walsh, a young couple from Seattle who were hitchhiking across the country in January 1990, just months before Rhoades' arrest. Douglas, 28, and Patricia, 24, were trying to reach Georgia, but were last seen at a truck stop in Texas on January 6, 1990. Their families reported them missing, but hitchhikers who disappear often aren't vigorously investigated because they're transient by nature. It wasn't until March 1990 that a motorist discovered Douglas's body along a highway in Sutton County, Texas. He had been shot in the back of the head, execution style. Patricia's body was never found. When investigators discovered photographs of a young woman matching Patricia's description among the materials seized from Rhoades' truck, and when they matched Rhoades' travel logs to the Texas area during early January 1990, they concluded he had picked up Douglas and Patricia, murdered Douglas quickly, and then held Patricia captive for weeks before killing her and disposing of her body in an unknown location. This case demonstrated Rhoades' willingness to target couples, not just lone women, and his complete lack of empathy or hesitation about killing anyone who stood in the way of his obsessions. The legal proceedings against Robert Ben Rhoades were complicated by the multi-jurisdictional nature of his crimes. He had committed kidnapping and sexual assault in Arizona, where he was arrested, but investigators had evidence linking him to murders in Texas, Utah, Illinois, and possibly dozens of other states. Prosecutors had to decide which charges to pursue first and in which jurisdictions, balancing the strength of evidence against the likelihood of conviction and the severity of potential sentences. Arizona prosecutors proceeded first with charges related to the kidnapping and sexual assault of victim A, the woman Trooper Miller had rescued from Rhoades' truck. This case was the strongest because they had a living victim who could testify. They had caught Rhoades in the act, and they had overwhelming physical evidence from the truck itself. In 1992, Rhoades was convicted of kidnapping and sexual assault in Arizona and sentenced to life in prison. This conviction ensured that Rhoades would never be free again, even if other prosecutions failed, providing some measure of justice for his victims and protection for potential future victims. But prosecutors in Illinois and Texas wanted to try Rhoades for murder. The families of Regina K. Walters, Ricky Lee Jones, and Douglas Ziskowski and Patricia Walsh deserved justice, and investigators wanted to hold Rhoades accountable for the killings they could prove beyond any reasonable doubt. The challenge was building cases that would stand up in court, particularly given that some of the crimes had occurred years earlier, some bodies had never been recovered, and the evidence was largely circumstantial. Photographs, travel logs, and forensic evidence linking Rhoades to the general areas where bodies were found. Illinois prosecutors took the lead in prosecuting Rhoades for the murder of Regina K. Walters. Her body had been discovered in an abandoned barn in Millard County, Illinois, on April 1st, 1990, the same day Rhoades was arrested in Arizona. The medical examiner determined she had been strangled to death and that she had suffered prolonged torture before her death, burns, cuts, and other injuries consistent with weeks of abuse. But the strongest evidence linking Rhoades to Regina's murder was the series of photographs found in his truck showing her deterioration during captivity, culminating in the final photograph showing her in the barn, wearing the black dress and heels, taken just moments before her murder. The trial for Regina's murder didn't begin until 1994, nearly 4 years after Rhoades' arrest, due to extensive pre-trial proceedings including competency evaluations, motions to suppress evidence, and battles over whether the photographs and other materials from Rhoades' truck would be admissible. Rhoades' defense attorneys argued that the photographs and materials had been seized in an unlawful search, that Trooper Miller had exceeded the scope of Rhoades' consent when he opened the sleeper cab, and that all evidence discovered as a result should be excluded. The Illinois court ultimately ruled that the search was lawful because Miller had heard sounds from the sleeper cab, giving him probable cause to believe someone was in distress, creating an exigent circumstance that justified the search. The trial itself was emotionally devastating for Regina's family. Her mother testified about Regina running away in February 1990, the family's desperate search for her, and the notification in April that her body had been found. Forensic pathologists testified about Regina's injuries, describing in clinical detail the torture she had endured over weeks of captivity. Most horrifyingly, prosecutors presented the photographs Rhoades had taken of Regina, showing the jury the visual documentation of her captivity and the terror in her eyes. The final photograph, Regina in the barn moments before her death, was so disturbing that several jurors were visibly upset, and the judge had to call for a recess. Rhoades' defense strategy was to argue that while he had kidnapped Regina and held her captive, someone else had actually killed her. Defense attorneys suggested that Rhoades had released Regina at the barn and that she had been killed by an unknown third party, or that Rhoades' accomplice, whom they claimed existed but never identified, had committed the murder. It was a desperate argument contradicted by all the evidence, but it was the only defense available given the overwhelming proof of Rhoades' guilt. On October 27, 1994, after less than a day of deliberation, the jury found Robert Ben Rhoades guilty of first-degree murder in the death of Regina K. Walters. Under Illinois law, Rhoades was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Combined with his existing life sentence from Arizona, this meant Rhoades would never see freedom again. Regina's mother released a statement saying the conviction brought some measure of closure, but that nothing could bring back her daughter or undo the suffering Regina had endured in her final weeks of life. Texas prosecutors then sought to try Rhoades for the murders of Douglas Siskowski and Patricia Walsh, but the case proved more difficult because Douglas's body had been found in Texas, while Patricia's body had never been recovered. Prosecutors could prove that Rhoades had likely killed Douglas. He had been shot with a .38 caliber pistol that matched a gun found in Rhoades' truck, and Rhoades' travel logs placed him in the area where Douglas's body was discovered. But charging Rhoades with Patricia's murder without a body was more complicated. requiring prosecutors to prove beyond reasonable doubt that she was dead and that Rhoades had killed her. In 1990s Texas, it was rare but not impossible to secure a murder conviction without a body. Prosecutors would need to present overwhelming circumstantial evidence that Patricia was dead, that she hadn't simply run away or disappeared voluntarily, and that Rhoades was responsible. The photographs of a young woman matching Patricia's description that were found in Rhoades's truck, combined with witness testimony, placing Douglas and Patricia at truck stops where Rhoades had been present, and Rhoades's travel patterns matching the timeline of their disappearance, made the case theoretically prosecutable. However, after extensive discussion with Patricia's family, prosecutors made the difficult decision not to pursue murder charges for her death at that time. The family was exhausted from years of uncertainty, and there was concern that a trial focused on Patricia's murder without her body might result in acquittal or a hung jury, which would prevent future prosecution if her body were ever found. Instead, Texas prosecutors agreed to hold the case open, maintaining the option to charge Rhoades if new evidence emerged, while focusing their resources on supporting the Illinois prosecution. With Rhoades convicted and sentenced to life without parole in both Arizona and Illinois, he was transferred to the Illinois Department of Corrections to serve his sentences. He was placed in maximum security at Menard Correctional Center in southern Illinois, a facility known for housing the state's most dangerous offenders. In prison, Rhoades largely kept to himself, maintaining a low profile and avoiding the attention that sometimes follows high-profile inmates. But the investigation into Rhoades's crimes continued even after his conviction. The FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit remained convinced that Rhoades had killed dozens, possibly more than 100 women over his 2-decade trucking career. The photographs and trophies found in his truck represented women who had never been identified or whose disappearances had never been reported. Investigators continued trying to match the photographs to missing persons cases, reaching out to families whose loved ones had disappeared near truck routes during the 1970s and 1980s, hoping to provide closure to families who had spent years wondering what happened to their daughters, sisters, and mothers. Several additional victims were identified through this painstaking investigative work. One photograph showed a young African-American woman who was eventually identified as having disappeared from a truck stop in Louisiana in 1985. Another photograph showed a teenage girl who matched the description of a runaway from Texas who had vanished in 1983. In each case, investigators tried to build enough evidence to charge Rhoades with additional murders, but the passage of time, the lack of bodies, and the challenges of proving murder based on decades-old circumstantial evidence made prosecution difficult. In 2005, the FBI formally established the Highway Serial Killings Initiative as part of the Violent Criminal Apprehension Program, VICAP. The initiative was created specifically in response to cases like Robert Ben Rhoades's, recognizing that the interstate highway system provides perfect cover for serial killers who target vulnerable populations. The initiative works by analyzing violent crimes committed on or near highways, looking for patterns that might indicate a serial offender, and facilitating information sharing between law enforcement agencies in different states. The Highway Serial Killings Initiative identified a disturbing pattern. Approximately 500 murder victims had been found along or near interstate highways over the previous 30 years, many of them sex workers, hitchhikers, or runaways, whose bodies were dumped in remote areas. In many cases, victims were never identified, buried as Jane does, in unmarked graves. The initiative determined that many of these murders were likely committed by long-haul truckers. with investigators identifying at least 20 confirmed cases of truckers who had killed multiple victims using their trucks and their cross-country routes as tools for serial murder. Robert Ben Rhoades became the case study for understanding truck driver serial killers. FBI behavioral analysts studied his methods, his victim selection, his use of his truck as both hunting ground and mobile crime scene, and his ability to evade capture for 2 decades. They used what they learned from Rhoades to develop training materials for law enforcement on how to recognize signs of truck driver predators and how to investigate crimes committed along highways across multiple jurisdictions. The Rhoades case also led to changes in the trucking industry itself. While most truck drivers are hard-working, law-abiding professionals, the industry recognized that their work environment, long hours of isolation, minimal supervision, constant travel, could attract predators. Major trucking companies began implementing more stringent background checks, requiring psychological evaluations for drivers, and installing GPS tracking and monitoring systems in trucks to track driver movements and identify concerning patterns. Truck stops and rest areas, where Rhoades had hunted for victims for 2 decades, also implemented safety measures. Many facilities installed security cameras covering parking areas, established partnerships with law enforcement for regular patrols, and created hotlines for sex workers and vulnerable individuals to report suspicious activity or request help without fear of arrest. These measures didn't eliminate the problem. Truck stops remain locations where vulnerable people and predators intersect, but they reduced opportunities for criminals like Rhoades to operate with impunity. As the years passed, and Robert Ben Rhoades remained in prison serving his life sentences, investigators continued working to identify additional victims and bring closure to families. In 2010, 20 years after Rhoades' arrest, investigators achieved a breakthrough when they finally identified the young woman from the photographs showing her captivity and torture, the images that had haunted investigators for 2 decades. Using advancing DNA technology and genetic genealogy techniques, they determined her identity and reached out to her family, who had reported her missing in 1985. The family had spent 25 years not knowing what happened to their daughter, hoping she had simply run away and built a new life somewhere. Learning the truth, that she had been tortured and murdered by Robert Ben Rhoades, was devastating, but it provided the closure they had desperately needed for a quarter century. This identification, along with several others made using modern forensic techniques, allowed prosecutors to consider bringing additional charges against Rhoades for murders that could now be proven. In 2012, prosecutors in Texas reopened discussions about charging Rhoades with Patricia Walsh's murder, even without recovering her body. By this point, Texas law and legal precedent had evolved to make bodiless murder prosecutions more feasible, and prosecutors believed they could prove Patricia's death beyond reasonable doubt using the totality of evidence: photographs, witness testimony, Rhoades' travel logs, and Douglas Ziskowski's murder, which demonstrated Rhoades' presence and culpability. However, the Walsh family, after extensive consultation with prosecutors and victim advocates, ultimately decided against pursuing a trial. Patricia's mother, who had spent over 20 years grieving her daughter's death, was in her 80s and in declining health. The prospect of another trial, with all the emotional trauma and media attention that would entail, was simply too much. The family found some solace in knowing that Rhoades was already serving multiple life sentences without parole and would never be free, and they chose to remember Patricia in private rather than reliving her death in a public courtroom. similar decisions were made by families of other identified victims. While the knowledge of what happened to their loved ones brought some closure, many families chose not to pursue additional prosecutions, believing that the emotional cost outweighed any additional justice that convictions might provide when Rhoades was already guaranteed to die in prison. This decision reflected the complex reality of serial murder cases. While prosecutors and investigators want to hold offenders accountable for every crime, victims' families sometimes prioritize their own healing over additional legal proceedings. Throughout his incarceration, Robert Ben Rhoades has maintained a disturbing silence about his crimes. Unlike some serial killers who grant interviews, write confessions, or provide information about additional victims, Rhoades has largely refused to cooperate with investigators or speak publicly about what he did. On the rare occasions when he has interacted with investigators or journalists, he has been coldly detached, showing no remorse or empathy for his victims, treating his crimes as if they were simply things that happened rather than horrific acts of torture and murder he chose to commit. In one documented interview conducted by FBI behavioral analysts in the late 1990s, Rhoades was asked how many women he had killed over his trucking career. He smiled but said nothing, leaving investigators to wonder whether his silence was intended to protect himself from additional prosecution, or whether it was simply another form of torment, denying the families of his victims the closure of knowing what happened to their loved ones. When asked why he tortured his victims for extended periods before killing them, Rhoades replied simply, "Because I could," a statement that captured the essence of his sadistic personality. He committed these crimes not out of rage or psychosis, but because he enjoyed the power and control that came from complete domination over another human being. Psychological evaluations of Rhoades conducted over the years have consistently diagnosed him as a sexual sadist with antisocial personality disorder, what is commonly referred to as a psychopath. These diagnoses mean that Rhoades derives sexual pleasure from inflicting pain and suffering, lacks empathy or conscience, views other people as objects to be used for his gratification, rather than as human beings with inherent worth, and is highly unlikely to ever experience genuine remorse or rehabilitation. Forensic psychologists who have evaluated him consider him among the most dangerous individuals they have encountered, someone who would almost certainly kill again if ever given the opportunity. The impact of Robert Ben Rhoades' crimes extended far beyond his direct victims and their families. His case fundamentally changed how law enforcement understands and investigates serial murders committed across multiple jurisdictions. Before Rhoades, local police departments often investigated murders in isolation, not recognizing that bodies found along highways in their jurisdiction might be connected to similar murders in other states. The Highway Serial Killings Initiative, established in response to cases like Rhoades's, now facilitates communication between law enforcement agencies and helps identify patterns that suggest serial offenders. The trucking industry also underwent significant changes in the wake of Rhoades's case. While the vast majority of truck drivers are honest, hard-working professionals who would never harm anyone, the industry acknowledged that the nature of long-haul trucking, extended time on the road, minimal oversight, access to vulnerable populations at truck stops, created opportunities for predators. Industry associations worked with law enforcement to develop training programs teaching drivers how to recognize and report suspicious activity, implemented stronger background checks and screening for new drivers, and installed monitoring systems in trucks to track driver behavior and location. Advocacy organizations working with sex workers and vulnerable populations also used Rhoades's case to push for policy changes. They argued that criminalization of sex work made victims less likely to report suspicious activity or seek help, allowing predators like Rhoades to target them with impunity. While full decriminalization remains controversial, many jurisdictions have adopted harm reduction approaches that prioritize protecting vulnerable individuals over prosecution, making it easier for sex workers to report crimes without fear of arrest. The victims of Robert Ben Rhoades represent a cross-section of America's most marginalized populations: runaways fleeing abusive homes, sex workers struggling with addiction, hitchhikers trying to get from one place to another, women whose disappearances weren't immediately reported or vigorously investigated because society had written them off as unimportant. Regina K. Walters was 14 years old when she ran away from home with her boyfriend, seeking a better life. Patricia Walsh was 24 years old, hitchhiking across the country with the man she loved. The many unidentified women whose photographs were found in Rhoades' truck, women whose names we may never know, each had families, friends, dreams, and futures that Rhoades stole for his own pleasure. The case also highlighted systemic failures in how America treats vulnerable populations and investigates crimes against them. Rhoades was arrested in 1985 after a victim escaped and reported being held captive and tortured, but prosecutors declined to pursue charges because they didn't think a jury would believe a sex worker with a criminal record. That decision allowed Rhoades to continue killing for 5 more years, claiming additional lives that might have been saved if that first prosecution had succeeded. Similarly, the 1987 way station inspector who noted unusual modifications to Rhoades' truck but didn't investigate further represents a missed opportunity that haunts investigators to this day. These failures reflect broader societal attitudes about whose lives matter and whose disappearances deserve investigation. When middle-class teenagers from stable homes go missing, the cases generate massive media coverage, national searches, and exhaustive investigations. When sex workers, addicts, or runaways disappear, their cases often receive minimal attention, filed away as probable runaways with perfunctory investigations. Predators like Rhoades deliberately target these vulnerable populations precisely because they know their crimes are less likely to be reported or investigated. As of 2025, Robert Ben Rhoades is 79 years old and remains incarcerated at Menard Correctional Center in Illinois, serving multiple life sentences without possibility of parole. He suffers from various health conditions related to aging and is reportedly in declining health, though prison officials have provided few details citing privacy concerns. He will almost certainly die in prison, likely within the next 5 to 10 years, never having faced full accountability for the true scope of his crimes. The FBI estimates that Rhoades killed at least 50 women over his 2-decade trucking career, and possibly more than 100. Only 3 murders have been conclusively proven in court: Regina K. Walters, Douglas Ziskowski, and the victim in his Arizona case. Dozens of other cases have been linked to him through photographs, forensic evidence, and travel logs. But without bodies or living witnesses, prosecutors have been unable to bring additional charges. Many victims will never be identified, their photographs filed away in evidence rooms, their families never knowing what happened to them. The Highway Serial Killings Initiative that grew out of Rhoades' case has been remarkably successful in identifying other truck driver serial killers and solving cold cases. Since its establishment in 2005, the initiative has helped solve over 100 highway murders and has identified multiple serial offenders who might otherwise have continued killing undetected. The database now contains information on approximately 750 murder victims found along highways, with patterns suggesting that roughly 20 to 30 serial killers may be operating at any given time using America's interstate system as their hunting ground. The case of Robert Ben Rhoades serves as a grim reminder that serial killers don't always fit the stereotypes portrayed in popular culture. Rhoades wasn't a loner who lived in his mother's basement collecting newspaper clippings. He was a truck driver, a job that millions of Americans perform every day. He was married multiple times, had relationships, held steady employment, and to casual observers appeared to be a normal person. His crimes went undetected for 2 decades, not because he was a genius or because law enforcement was incompetent, but because the very structure of long-haul trucking, constant travel across multiple jurisdictions, targeting vulnerable victims whose disappearances often went unreported, provided perfect cover for his predation. The photographs found in Rhoades' truck, images of terrified women in various stages of captivity and torture, haunt everyone who has seen them. These weren't abstract crime scene photos or clinical evidence. They were visual documentation of human suffering, of women experiencing the worst moments of their lives, moments that for many would be their final hours. The eyes of these women, showing terror, pain, pleading, and resignation, represent the true cost of Rhoades' 2-decade reign of terror. Each photograph represents a daughter, a sister, a mother, a friend, a human being whose life had value, but who became a victim of a predator who saw them only as objects for his sadistic gratification. For the families of Rhoades' victims, there is no closure, no moment when the pain ends. Regina K. Walters' mother has spent over 30 years living with the knowledge of what her daughter endured in her final weeks. Patricia Walsh's family spent over 20 years not knowing what happened to her, and now must live with the knowledge that she was tortured and murdered. Her body never recovered. The families of the unidentified women, whose photographs remain in evidence files, live in limbo, not knowing for certain whether their missing loved ones were Rhoades' victims, unable to mourn properly without confirmation of death, haunted by uncertainty. How did one truck driver terrorize America for 2 decades? The answer is both simple and complex. Robert Ben Rhoades was a sexual sadist who discovered that long-haul trucking provided the perfect cover for serial predation. Constant mobility across state lines, access to vulnerable populations at truck stops and rest areas, a mobile crime scene that could be sanitized between victims, and victims whose disappearances often went unreported or uninvestigated. He combined these structural advantages with meticulous planning, ruthless victim selection, and complete lack of conscience to create one of the most prolific serial murder sprees in American history. But Rhoades' success also reflected systemic failures. Law enforcement agencies that didn't communicate across jurisdictional lines, a society that didn't take crimes against sex workers and runaways seriously, prosecutors who declined to prosecute early cases that might have stopped him, and a trucking industry that didn't adequately screen or monitor drivers. These failures allowed Rhoades to kill for 2 decades, claiming dozens of lives that might have been saved if the warning signs had been heeded and the system had worked as it should. The legacy of Robert Ben Rhoades is written in the bodies found along America's highways, in the missing persons cases that remain open decades later, in the families that will never recover from their losses, and in the systemic changes that emerged from his crimes. The Highway Serial Killings Initiative, improved communication between law enforcement agencies, increased safety measures at truck stops, and greater attention to crimes against vulnerable populations all represent positive changes born from tragedy. But perhaps the most important legacy is the reminder that every victim matters. The women Robert Ben Rhoades tortured and murdered weren't statistics or anonymous victims. They were human beings with names, families, dreams, and value. Regina K. Walters was 14 years old. Patricia Walsh was 24 years old. The many unidentified women whose photographs remain in evidence files had lives that mattered even if we don't know their names. They deserve to be remembered not just as victims of a monster, but as people whose lives had meaning and whose losses diminished all of us. Robert Ben Rhoades will die in prison. His crimes never fully accounted for. His victims never fully identified. His reign of terror finally ended, but its impact lasting forever. The highways he traveled, the truck stops where he hunted, the remote areas where he disposed of bodies, these places remain silent witnesses to 2 decades of horror. And somewhere in America, there are families who don't know what happened to their daughters and sisters, families who may never learn that their loved ones crossed paths with a predator who turned America's interstate system into his personal hunting ground. This is how one truck driver terrorized America for 2 decades, through a combination of calculated predation, systemic failures, and the perfect cover provided by a job that millions of honest people perform safely every day. The story of Robert Ben Rhoades is a cautionary tale about the banality of evil, the importance of protecting vulnerable populations, and the terrible cost of allowing predators to operate in plain sight, simply because their victims don't fit society's definition of who deserves protection and justice.